I welcome you all again to this Bay of Bengal Economic Dialogue, second Bay of Bengal Economic Dialogue 2022. So we are very much honored to have Dr. Vivek Debroy, Chairman, Prime Minister Economic Advisory Council India, to be the keynote speaker of this dialogue. And also we have Ambassador Sumit Nakandala, former Secretary General of BIMSTEC, and at this time he's the Senior Director, Bandanayaka Center for International Studies, Colombo, to chair this session. So the way we are going to have this session is that it's around 45 minutes session. So we'll have a session for open discussion as well. So I will request Ambassador Sumit Nakandala as the chair to moderate that too, and Sanem team will help Ambassador Nakandala to conduct this open discussion session. I request the participants to type your questions or comments in the chat box. And if you want to say something during the open discussion session, please raise your hand, and Sanem team will help the Honorable Chair to locate you and to allow you for a very brief your introduction or brief intervention. So with this, may I now request Ambassador Sumit Nakandala to conduct the session. Over to you.
Thank you, Salim. Once again, good evening to everybody. I think we had a very good start during the inaugural session. We heard what the State Minister had shared with us today. It's important. And the keynote address, in fact, my pleasant duty is to introduce Dr. Vivek Debroy to the audience, and I don't think Dr. Debroy needs any additional introduction to people who are familiar with economics in the region. However, it's part of my duty as a chair of the session. Dr. Debroy currently is the chairman of the Economic Advisory Council to the Prime Minister of India, and he's also a member of Niti Aayog, the premier government think tank of the government of India. And he had his early education in Kolkata, Delhi School of Economics, and Trinity College, Cambridge. He was awarded Padma Shri Award, which is the fourth highest civilian honor in India, in 2015. He has written widely. I have also had the privilege of listening when I was in Delhi a couple of times, and I have read his books and articles, especially on the economics and political science. And I'm also reminded by the fact, apart from Dr. Debroy's brilliant economic and academic career, is also very sophisticated historian by his own credit. We will, of course, the audience will be pleased to ask a number of questions during the Q&A session related to Bay of Bengal and its history, its archaeology, and how we should achieve our ultimate target of regional economic integration in the Bay of Bengal. Dr. Debroy, you will have around 20 to 25 minutes, and we hope to listen to you, especially because you are the chairman of the Economic Advisory Council of the Honorable Prime Minister, and how India is going to lead the entire group to achieve their final ambition, that is the integrated economic platform for the Bay of Bengal. I am sure that Dr. Salim and the team had no other better person than Dr. Debroy to deliver this important keynote address, because we are having the second Bay of Bengal economic dialogue just few weeks before the convening of the 5th BIMSTEC summit here in Colombo during the last few days of the month March. With these words, it's my great pleasure, Dr. Debroy, to invite you to deliver your keynote address. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Ibrahim.
Thank you, Ambassador Nakandala. Thank you, Professor Salim Relan, for inviting me and showing me this honor. I don't really deserve this honor because if I look at the list of people who are speakers and who are panelists, I recognize many familiar names, and many of them, most of them in fact, are far more qualified to deliver this keynote address than I am. Nonetheless, it was impossible for me to refuse, so here I am. Thank you, Sanem, as well. Though I gave up doing modeling a long time ago, but naturally I'm interested in South Asia and Southeast Asia, and therefore thanks once again for having invited me. BIMSTEC and the Bay of Bengal, which of course, as everyone knows, has several countries, and it's worth quickly mentioning the names once again, though everyone knows what their names are. Bangladesh, Bhutan, India, Nepal, Sri Lanka, Myanmar, and Thailand. The reason I wanted to mention these names yet again is that much before the advent of the Western colonial powers, this region was integrated economically. I'm not referring to political integration, I'm referring to economic integration. Much before the advent of Western colonial powers, this region was integrated. One only has to visit the many ports that now languish along the coastal regions, whether it's around Chittagong, whether it's along India's fairly long coastline, whether it is Sri Lanka. So there were extensive trade routes before the advent of the Western colonial powers. Sometimes in this day and age, one tends to forget that these trade routes existed and that these ports existed. Recently, I happened to visit Puducherry, Pondicherry. Pondicherry is now known as Puducherry. A lot of people visit Puducherry, and I'm talking about Indians. Most of them don't even know that in Puducherry, there used to be a seaport known as Arika Medu that facilitated flourishing sea trade. It was a seaport, it facilitated flourishing sea trade. Often when one talks about trade routes and economic relationships that existed historically, one has in mind the Silk Road, the Northern Silk Road, the Southern Silk Road. What sometimes escapes attention is that there was a very significant trade that happened along the coasts, along the oceans, via the sea route. BIMSTEC is still work in progress. It's very much work in progress. Well, 1997, or if one likes 2004, what needs to be stressed, and that's obvious, but it still needs to be stressed, is that BIMSTEC is not exclusively focused on trade and investment. There are 14 sectors, much more than trade and investment, and I will have remarks to make about the trade and investment part of it in a short while from now. Though these countries are unified because of historical legacies, they unified because of cultural legacies, and they have a lot of commonalities. The countries are fairly diverse. Diverse in terms of population. You have Bhutan and you have India. They are diverse in terms of the total level of GDP. Again, you have Bhutan and you have India. And they are diverse in terms of per capita income, whether measured through official exchange rates or measured through PPP exchange rates. And you have Nepal. What characterizes the entire region, of course, is that this entire region is relatively poor. And I'm using the word relative. Being relatively poor means that the priorities can often be different from those in more developed countries, the countries of the West, so to speak, the countries of the North, so to speak. And this is understandable. The priorities are going to be different. But going back to the theme that I mentioned, if one goes back and looks up the historical records, and it's a bit difficult to match them because the historical records don't necessarily match exactly the geographical boundaries of the countries today. Nonetheless, if one goes back and looks up the historical records, for instance, the work of Angus Madison and those who followed him, one would find that 2,000 years ago, this region on an average was as rich, defined in per capita income terms, as many of the so-called developed countries were 2,000 years ago. What happened? Well, essentially down the years, the trade and the economic integration collapsed for various reasons. And when I say trade and economic integration, before the First World War, it also meant free cross-border movements of labor. Cross-border movements of labor were not as restricted across countries as they were after World War I. Cross-border movement of capital, of course, in the sense that we understand it today, did not exist. But there was cross-border movement of labor. People moved from one country to another. That led to free flows of knowledge and innovation. This part of the world, this region, accounts for a very large share both of global population and of GDP. Today we are still in the midst of uncertainty. First there was uncertainty because of the COVID pandemic, and there is a session on COVID and the ensuing recovery. No sooner is the world recovering from the effects of the COVID pandemic, we confront additional geopolitical tensions. Distancing from those, the fact of the matter is, growth is plateauing in the West and in the North, and that's inevitable. So the sources of growth for the entire world will have to come from Asia, of which the BIMSTEC countries are a part, and will have to come from Africa. Those will be the main sources of growth. The main sources of world economic growth, dealing from the immediate effects of the pandemic and the current tensions, will not be the Americas, will not be Europe, it will be this region. Growth is not an end in itself. It's also important for this region to grow fast, to attain the goals of the sustainable, of the SDGs, to attain the targets and the indicators of the SDGs. In passing, one of the questions we need to ask, not necessarily at this forum, but as countries, one of the questions we need to ask is who sets the global agenda? There are certain global institutions that deliver so-called global public goods. Those may be the Bretton Woods institutions, those may be others, but who sets the agenda? What role do these countries as a whole have to play in determining the agenda set historically by the West and the North? Often when one looks at something like BIMSTEC, and I repeat, BIMSTEC is not only about trade and investment, but whenever one looks at such a grouping, one tends to look at it with the lens of trade and investments. Now, trade and investments are important, and I'm fully aware that there's a panel on trade and investments, and the people who are speaking at that panel on trade and investments are far more qualified. They've spent years researching trade and investment flows in the region than I am. Nonetheless, I want to flag that if we look at it purely narrow trade and investment terms and we reduce BIMSTEC to a regional trade agreement, which actually it is not, we will not be able to tap the full potential. Why am I saying this? There are several reasons why I'm saying this. Most traditional regional trading agreements, and BIMSTEC is not one of those, have been about pure trade. One can debate whether the economies we are talking about are competitive or complementary. And there is nothing called completely competitive or completely complementary. But if we look at it purely from the perspective of trade, anyone who has worked on trade agreements will know that the intent of liberalization will be circumvented through negative lists. The intent of trade liberalization will be circumvented through TBT and SPS agreements. There will be complicated rules of origin. In any case, agriculture will be outside any narrow trade agreement. And much of trade today is determined not by narrow trade liberalization per se, but also by cross-border investment liberalization. And the moment we get into cross-border investment liberalization, free flows of capital, we will get into the vexatious issue of cross-border movements of labor. These are not very easy issues to resolve. And whenever there are negotiations, and as part of the agenda, at some point there will be a free trade agreement of sorts for BIMSTEC, we will confront these issues. These issues are no different from the issues we bring to the negotiating table when we negotiate at WTO or otherwise with more advanced countries. The limited point I'm making is just because it happens to be BIMSTEC, these issues are not going to go away. I'm not saying that we should not address these issues, but I am making the point that purely interpreted in trade and investment terms, it's going to be a difficult process of liberalization. Regional trade agreements, GATT, WTO, all of these are about border measures. When there is liberalization at the border, whether through GATT or WTO, whether it's accession to the system, whether it's through RTAs, it's kind of exogenously imposed. They become easier to handle if the endogenous reform template is more or less in parallel with whatever is being suggested exogenously for the cross-border. For this region as a whole, though trade is important, the cross-border investments are important, the primary sources of growth, to my mind, are going to be endogenous. They are going to be endogenous, they are going to involve efficient land markets, efficient labor markets, efficient capital markets, and productivity. So that's the avenue of endogenous and internal reforms. For each of these countries, there are several issues that arise. One issue that arises is what is going to be the role of the government. In all of these countries, the government often has a malign role in terms of doing what it should not be doing. So if the government is doing what it should not be doing, it is necessary to reduce that malign role of the government and improve ease of doing business, not just for the corporate sector, but ease of doing business in general. But in addition, our government must also deliver public goods, and I'm not using the expression public goods in a narrow economic sense, in the sense of Paul Samuelson, public goods in the sense of something that won't be delivered by the market. The government must deliver those, ensure a regulatory structure, ensure that there is revenue for doing what the government needs to do for public expenditure, ensure efficiency in that public expenditure. And this is the benign role of the government. The benign role of the government is not going to go away. For instance, in health, in education. Now you will say all of this is internal to a country. What has BIMSTEC got to do with it? I think BIMSTEC has got everything to do with it, because although these are internal issues, they are not external. There is a lot that can be done in terms of exchange of information, in terms of cooperation, in terms of exchange of best practices. I said these countries are relatively poor, and poverty alleviation is part of is explicitly part of the agenda, as is health, as is public health. Education isn't directly important, isn't directly mentioned, but it's part of the social sector. So there's a lot that can be done through the exchange of information, through people-to-people contacts, but tapping what's also part of the BIMSTEC agenda, the history of common cultures, the history of that common legacy, what once upon a time used to be called track 2, it still is sometimes. In other words, to take BIMSTEC forward, it's not sufficient only to look at what government is going to do, it's also important to look at events like these, which are part of track 2 and which actually feed into what governments eventually do. I mentioned that history, and in that history, as is obvious, a very important role was played by infrastructure. And again, there is a panel on infrastructure. There are experts on infrastructure who will speak in that panel. Transport and communication have historically always delivered disproportionately high multiplier benefits. And transport and communication is again one of the 14 sectors. It means the whole hog of transportation. Not just civil aviation and roads and railways, but also the sea, also the coast. Which brings me to one other important point, which is probably the last point that I'm going to make. I said earlier that most of these countries share a coast. And sharing the coast means not just fisheries, it also means the protection of the environment. And some countries in this region are much more prone to adverse effects as a result of environmental degradation and climate change. The reason this meeting is happening virtually as opposed to physically, and I'm delighted if I'm ever invited to Dhaka, but the reason it's happening virtually is that we are still recovering from the COVID pandemic. The worst of the pandemic may be over. But today it was the pandemic. Tomorrow it may be some other kind of disaster, natural or man-made. So disaster management within the climate framework or beyond the climate framework is, I think, another major area where there's plenty of scope for cooperation and exchange of information and exchange of knowledge within the BIMSTEC framework. BIMSTEC owes its name to Bay of Bengal. That part, that ocean has been through several names. In Bengali, of course, it is referred to as Bangoposagar, Bay of Bengal, on the ocean. Bengal Ocean. I've come to the end of what I wanted to say, and thank you once again for having invited me and having shown me the honor. But at the end, I cannot but resist the temptation to quote from a Bengali poet. Although except the Bangladeshis, the others will not understand, but you will get the sense of it. And this poet I'm going to quote is Satyendra Datta. And this famous poem by Satyendra Datta begins Bongo Amar Janani Amar, with the bongo being interpreted in a Bay of Bengal sense. And somewhere towards the end it says, Kete jabe megh nobino gorim matibe abar lolate tor, which is the optimism that the future of this particular region continues to be bright. COVID has disrupted matters, but I believe that the future of this region continues to be bright, and that is going to be facilitated certainly by what governments do, certainly by what citizens do, but it is also going to be facilitated by an initiative like BIMSTEC, and it's also going to be facilitated by initiatives like the present one that SANEM has ensured. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor De Broglie. I think after so many years, we all were fortunate to listen to a very enriching personal narrative with your own journey. I was very pleased when you mentioned about Arikamedu, because I have been to that place and then found the Roman beads. So that itself, not only Arikamedu, but Machilipatnam, all the ports in the Coromandel coast, that is part of the Bay of Bengal, the Eastern Indian Ocean. And you know what reminded me when I was listening to you, the work done by Professor Kenneth Hall around the Bay of Bengal and Southeast Asia. And in fact, this reminds me, we had the first BIMSTEC Foundation Day lecture in Dhaka, and I had the privilege of inviting Professor Kenneth Hall to deliver that. I couldn't find anybody else suitable, but that's very wonderful. And I am also touched by your deep sense of realization that, which I used to say many times, BIMSTEC is nothing but, it's not the reinventing the wheel, but rediscovering our common cultural heritage in the Bay of Bengal. I think you have rekindled the minds of many people in listening to you. We are very grateful for your illuminating speech. And you have raised a number of important points, and it's a rare combination of two disciplines, that's economics and the historical facets in the region. Nobody will dispute that. Now, I think I should be assisted by SANEM Secretariat. If there are questions, please raise your hands, and then there can be some questions by raising your hand. And at one point of time, Professor De Broglie, I also would like you to little bit focus on the cultural aspect, the people-to-people contact within the Bay of Bengal, because I think much of the things have been written by Sunil Amrit in his book called Crossing Bay of Bengal. And you are
Respected
right,
Chair, we have received a question. May I share the question? Respected Chair, we have received a question.
Omar, just wait. Ambassador Sumit Nakandala is
just wait. No. I'll finish and then come back to you. In fact, Professor De Broglie, you said You talked about the integration of economic integration up until the advent of the colonialism in the Bay of Bengal. Between 1300 to 1500 AD, there were 5 trading networks within the region: Bay of Bengal network, the Malacca Strait, and so this has been there. So this is the context on which that we are trying to explore the economic integration and regional integration under the present context. Salim, I have concluded that initial remarks, and then we are ready to take questions.
Yes, Mr. Nakandala, from Sanim, I think we have a team. They will actually read out the questions from the chat box. At the same time, they will check whether if anyone from the participants wants to speak. So, Omar, probably you are going to take over.
Thank you, sir. We have received a question from Commander Kazi Hawk, who has asked that compared to other nearest regional forums like ASEAN, how much is BIMSTEC successful? And he has also asked that most of the BIMSTEC projects are taking a long time for implementation. How can I address these issues?
You can mention the other questions too, and then we can request the keynote speaker.
Yes. Sir, there's another question from Mr. Saifur Rahman, who has asked that what are the joint action plans so far taken by BIMSTEC in terms of sharing prosperity among the member states? We have received another question from Mr. Kazi Imadul Haq, who has asked that we all know BIMSTEC Charter of Duties, but what is the reason for the failures? And will China allow BIMSTEC to connect Thailand through land crossing their CMEC? Sir, we have received another question from Ms. Deblina, who have remarked that a part of the multi.
Omar, I think we should actually allow the keynote speaker to respond.
The questions are.
Yes, and then we'll in the second round probably we can come back to the other questions.
Thank you for those questions. I actually hate the expression keynote session, because the expression keynote session tends to suggest that I have a key which will open every lock that is presented before me. I don't have answers to many of these questions, but let me make a few remarks before attempting some kind of answer. Most of these countries, well, they have different historical experiences, but several of these countries have gone through independence movements. So there is a history of independence movements, but those are history. They belong in the past. I think the societies have matured. There is a young generation, and the region is generally young. There is a young generation which no longer feels that national sovereignty is threatened the moment there is some kind of liberalization. The countries exist, they will continue to exist. And the liberalization, whatever form it takes, does not take away from the boundaries of countries. I don't know whether it's wishful thinking, but it's probably the case that the young no longer feel threatened, and in that particular sense, the societies have become more mature. But there is a flip side to it, and I'm harping on what the ambassador mentioned. Are the young familiar with this historical, cultural legacy with that historical connectivity? I don't think there are. And I think one of the major things that BIMSTEC can achieve beyond the actual government-to-government negotiations is the people-to-people cultural contacts which enable the young to know that this was the way it used to be, and there is no particular reason to feel threatened because some liberalization is being attempted. Having said this, I think we should be fair in terms of judging BIMSTEC. BIMSTEC is not that old. BIMSTEC is not that old. There have been dislocations. There was the financial crisis, there was the earlier financial crisis, and now the last 2 years have been knocked for a 6. And each country within the region has been facing its own individual problems. And there is one issue that I did not mention, now I'm mentioning it, but it's extremely important in the context of the region, and that is the issue of cross-border terrorism and security. If I try to measure the success of BIMSTEC, I don't think I should try to evaluate it purely in the narrow terms of what has happened in terms of reducing tariffs. That's the reason I said that should not be the right measure. I think there's been a lot of cooperation in the area of cross-border terrorism, ensuring security. I think we are beginning to see the integration of transportation networks, particularly on the road side. Now, yes, there are implementational problems. Some of them are teething problems. But those implementational problems should not take away from the fact that there is an aspirational goal. It will take a while to get to that aspirational goal. Have we achieved 100% of what BIMSTEC is supposed to do? Of course not. That's the reason it's aspirational. But is it 0%? I think not.
Thank you, Dr. Debra. So we have some more other questions. I can actually read out them. Debalina, she's asking, a part of the multidimensional cooperation which BIMSTEC aims at is digital security. And the pandemic has further necessitated a renewed focus on this. How does BIMSTEC accommodate cybersecurity aspect in cooperative security agenda, particularly in the post-pandemic times? I can see another question. So this question is related to digital security and how we can address this issue. Dr. Prabir De, he's saying that question, Dr. Debra, an excellent keynote, touched by his end quoting the poet Satyendranath Datta. And he's asking the question, today BIMSTEC countries face enormous challenges in meeting the obligations of pandemic, trade, production, development, etc. What is your take on smaller economies of BIMSTEC who suffer from huge resource crunch? So that is one question. And we have one more question, and then we also have a raised hand. We'll come back to the participant. So the question is Kazi Imdadul Haq. He's saying India has made India-ASEAN cooperation. India being a big country within BIMSTEC, why India has not taken initiative to connect BIMSTEC and ASEAN? So that's the question. And also we have...
Can you repeat the question? Why India?
Why India has not taken initiative to connect BIMSTEC and ASEAN? So this is a question from a participant, Kazi Imdadul Haq. And also, if you allow, we can request Dr. Christian Ploberger to speak very briefly. He has raised hand. If you can unmute.
Yes, just a second. I wrote my question before. I'm not sure if you saw it.
If you can introduce yourself very briefly, please.
Oh, yes. My name is Dr. Christian Ploberger. I'm a lecturer at Rajamangala University in Bangkok. And I'm an Austrian, but I'm living and working in Bangkok. I have an interest on geopolitical and regional politics in Southeast Asia and in Asia. My question is, to what extent BIMSTEC or the Bay of Bengal as a regional concept could be a challenge to the Indo-Pacific concept. After all, the Bay of Bengal have a history. Indo-Pacific, it's more a geopolitical construct. So if you look for the wider context of Indo-Pacific focus, to what extent a more regional focus, like the Bay of Bengal, could be a more successful approach, especially a successful approach from within the region, and how the two work together.
Dr. Christian. So, Ambassador Sumit Nakandala, we don't have any more questions. So I think this is the kind of final round of questions. So we can go straight to Dr. Lebroy.
But it's written down as well in the chat box.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, so let me try and answer those questions. The pandemic, which was an exogenous shock, and also the result of globalization in some way, has stimulated an increasing digitization, at least in the country that I come from, that is in India. Digitization in any case was being pushed, but digitization has received an extra fillip because of the pandemic. Digitization raises all kinds of issues. Cyber security was mentioned. There are issues connected with data privacy. At least in India, legislation is being drafted to handle such issues. Now, do realize that we are talking about technology. We are talking about technology which changes very, very fast. We are talking about cross-border ethics, which can often be malign. And we are talking about governments not always being able to keep track and keep pace with those kinds of malign attempts, and also not be in a position to enforce what needs to be done. In other words, cyber security is a complicated area. There are certain templates, and there are also issues that some of the servers are not located in this region but are located elsewhere. I know about India, I don't know about what each of these individual countries are doing, but for any progress on cyber security, we need to recognize that it has to be an incremental effort. It is not a one-shot exercise. So my response to cyber security would be, again, exchange of information, exchange of best practices. There's also the mention of the pandemic from which all of our countries are recovering. And what the pandemic stressed, certainly for India, and probably stressed for the other countries also, is the increased focus on public health, which is one of the 14, and efficient public expenditure on health. In some cases, this involves a re-switching of government expenditure. So again, I would say that not just the pandemic, but health broadly is an area where we have to learn, we have a lot to learn from each other. Resource crunch. It depends on what one means by resource crunch, what one means by resource. I presume the reference was to energy. But energy is not the only kind of resource. Of course, for energy, there is indeed a problem. But energy is not the only kind of resource. Most important resource that this region as a whole has is human resources. And of course, it has land, it has water. So I would say we interpret it in that broad sense. We do not have a scarcity of resources at all. We have human beings, we have land, we have water. If these are efficiently used, then it is possible to step up productivity levels, because after all, what is per capita income as a measure of development? Per capita income is nothing but the average productivity of the country's working citizens. So on that score, we have plenty of resources. We just need to use them more efficiently. A bridge between ASEAN. I think I've said it twice already and I'm saying it again. It would be unfair to look at BIMSTEC purely as a trade agreement. The agreement that we have with ASEAN, originally it was a trade agreement, then it encompassed services. Within BIMSTEC, we still do not have counterpart of a trade agreement, even if it includes services. And as I said earlier, negotiating such an agreement may be part of the agenda. It's not going to be that easy. Once we have such a trade agreement, encompassing perhaps goods and services, that is the time when one looks at this and India playing a role of bridging the two. But many of these agreements, they have been based on trade, investment and services. And therefore, I would say that let us look at BIMSTEC with a broader canvas. Indo-Pacific, that is the last question, I don't really know how to react. Because Indo-Pacific is a vast region, a very heterogeneous region. Here the countries are heterogeneous, large, small, so on and so forth. But at least there's a commonality in terms of what is used in the expression BIMSTEC, that is the Bay of Bengal. See, that seems to be a bit more tractable than an expression like Indo-Pacific, which is far broader.
Thank you, President Debroy. Do we have, I think we have another 5 minutes more to conclude this session. Do we have any further questions?
Well, the rules are that in those 5 minutes, any questions that are asked will be answered by the chairman.
So the question is, I can see a final question related to the kind of the political commitment. It would be...
What's that question?
Need for political commitment in the BIMSTEC region to make BIMSTEC successful. So that's what I have seen a kind of question related to that. Okay. Maybe Dr. Debroy can respond to that. No, how do you see the...
No, Dr. Debroy said that last question should be answered by the chair.
No, look, but what is political commitment? The political commitment is an indirect expression of what we want as citizens. Whatever we want as citizens, this is not like Switzerland, so whatever we want as citizens is then manifested in the form of a political commitment. This is not a government meeting, government mandated meeting. It is this kind of forum which generates the demand from within the individual countries to ensure that there is political commitment. So the responsibility for lack of political commitment devolves not only on governments, which are easy to blame, but it devolves also on us as citizens, because once we exert the countervailing pressure, the change begins to happen. And if you look at most free trade agreements, you will generally find that the demand had already started to happen on the part of citizens, on the part of enterprises, on the part of business, and the government mandated agreement actually just formalized what was often happening on the ground.
Thank you, Professor De Broglie. I think, Salim, we are completely running out of time, but then it's again my great pleasure to thank Professor De Broglie for wonderful exposition of ideas. His not only his skills and understanding about economics in the region, but I think he has delivered one of the most important keynote. Anyway, he doesn't like keynote because he is not having a key for anything. But thank you, sir. Thank you very much for devoting time. I know you are a very extremely busy person, but we are very grateful to you. Thank you. And with this, I will hand over the forum to Salim Bhai back. Thank you.
Thank you
so much. Thank you, Professor De Broglie, and of course, Mr. Sumit Nakandala. It was an excellent session. And especially, I wish the session could be lasted longer, but I know that our keynote speaker is extremely busy, and also we have other sessions where we will actually carry some of the points and questions which are raised in this session to the other sessions too. Thank you so much. So with this, we conclude our keynote session, and we'll have another session on post-COVID challenges and opportunities in 9 minutes from now. So we request the participants to stay tuned with this Zoom link. Same Zoom link will be valid. So we'll see you in a few minutes from now. Thank you.
Hey, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Professor De Broglie.